Welcome to the Midweek message. We're taking some lessons from the book of Ruth. I'm reading in chapter 2, verses 1 through 3 from the New Living Translation of the Bible. A little bit of a backstory. Naomi and her husband Elimelech left Judah and went to Moab because there was a famine. While they were in Moab, their two sons married Moabite women. They lived down there for a while, but during their time there, all three of the men died. Naomi's husband and the husbands of Orpah and Ruth. 3 women, 3 widows. What are they going to do? And so they had heard that the famine had lifted in Judah, and so Naomi said, I'm going to go back home. You girls stay here in Moab where you're from, restart your lives, have new families. And Orpah and Ruth both declared that they would go back with Naomi to Judah. But in the end, Orpah stayed in Moab, and Ruth went back with her to Judah. And when they ended up in the vicinity of Bethlehem, that's where we pick up in chapter 2. So 2 women, both widows, what are they going to do? Now there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband Elimelech. One day Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go out into the harvest fields to pick up the stalks of grain left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it. Naomi replied, all right, my daughter, go ahead. So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters, and as it happened, she found herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law, Elimelech. Let's look at these verses one by one. Now there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech. Okay, so Naomi's back home. She's back where family is. She's back where she got a little bit of a foundation and a support system. And Ruth is with her. Verse 2, one day Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go out into the harvest fields to pick up the stalks of grain left behind by anyone who's kind enough to let me do it. Naomi replied, all right, my daughter, go ahead. Now the Israelites had been instructed in the law not to reap all of their fields, all of the grain out of any of their fields. They were to round off the corners and leave a little bit of grain in the corners of the field. And also things that fell by the way, they were to leave them there. And this was so that poor people could go into the fields and reap some of the harvest for themselves, to sustain themselves, some of the harvest of the more wealthy landowners and farmers. And so they weren't supposed to reap the entire field. And so Naomi said, we need to do something, or Ruth said, Naomi, we need to do something to survive. So let me go out and find a field that I can get some grain from, and so we can live. And so she said, all right, my daughter, go ahead and glean is what the word was, glean in the field. And verse 3, so Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters, and as it happened, she found herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz, a relative of her father-in-law, Elimelech. So Ruth goes out and she finds a field to glean in, one that she's able to gather some grain for she and Naomi and their sustenance. And she walks behind the harvesters, and things that they drop she will pick up. And she works in the corners of the field, which they were instructed, the harvesters, to round off and not reap all of that grain, not take all of their provisions that they had provided for themselves. They were not to keep them to themselves. They were to share them. And so she was working in the field. Lo and behold, she was in the field of a relative of Naomi's deceased husband, Elimelech. God is in control of every aspect of our lives. And sometimes he is directing us, even though we do not realize that he is doing so.